Daf, we'll start slowly. Today's daf is daf Zayin. So we started Masechet Kiddushin almost a week ago, and we have been discussing, and today we'll see sort of the confluence of all of these things. The fact that the fundamental transaction, let's use that word, even though it's a little bit of a challenging word, in marrying a woman is a kinyan, right? You have to make some kinyan. And as we're going to learn throughout this whole Masechet, we learn all about kinyanim. It's not the only place, but it's one of the places. Kinyan means how do you acquire something, right? So if I walk over to someone and say, I'd like to buy your car, and they say, sure, you can buy my car. How do you effectuate the fact that the car is now mine, and next day, if there's a hurricane and it gets destroyed, it's my problem, right? Or whatever. So same thing would be true about a wife or a slave or an eved is another case, or a field, or all kinds of different things. And so we've kept learning kicha mistei Ephron, which is that yikach ish isha, a man takes a woman, and that's similar to the field that Ephron bought, which was a kinyan, field he bought from Ephron, I guess. Correct, the field of Ephron that Avram bought. And so we learn out these kinyanim, but of course there are many differences. And one of the differences that we've discussed is you can buy, you can make a marriage through a shtar. You can buy a field through a shtar, but you can't buy a watch through a shtar, right? So metaltalin in general, if you buy something that's movable, the way you're kona something that's movable is by picking it up, by something called meshicha, right? Now, we don't require you to do that for a field. It would be very challenging, or a house, for example. And we also don't allow you to do that when you get married, right? You can't say, I'm going to lift you and therefore acquire you as a wife. So that would also be very challenging. So we're going to...
In modern secular law, there are also different rules on how you acquire things depending on the type of property.
Right, which makes sense, of course.
If you're buying a car or a house, there has to be registration of the sale for it to be fully accepted. But
that's generally a shtar, basically.
Basically. But it also has to be registered with the government, which is not a halakhic thing.
Right. So shtar we see did work, but there's other ways to acquire property, and one of them is called chazakah. Remember, if you just live on it, right, then that's one way. Again, we didn't discuss that about marriage. You can just marry, common law marriage, as they put it, right, and call that a marriage. It's not one of them, but we're going to keep going through all of this today. But yesterday, we started getting into the nitty gritty of we talked about one kinyan yesterday, which I want to mention again, called kinyan chalipin, right? Kinyan chalipin is what we do when we sell our chametz usually, right? How do you give over the chametz? So writing a shtar to give over chametz is problematic because chametz is metaltalin, right? So you can't acquire something that's metaltalin, that's movable with a shtar. Right, you can acquire a house, but you can't acquire metaltalin necessarily. So we give it over to the source using, there's different ways, of course, but one way is by doing a chalipin, where you traditionally hand an object to the person buying it from you, the person selling the chametz in that case, and they give it back to you. And you didn't give them anything. They don't get to keep it. They keep it, they're stealing. But through that transaction, they acquire it. That does not work for an isha. We discussed yesterday. It's a machloket, but it does not work for an isha. If you give a woman a ring and say, you can have this ring for the wedding, but I want it back afterwards, then she is not married. Okay? Maybe that's a good thing. Says the Gemara today, says Rava, I've got some interesting new cases. Amar Rava, the last line of the Vav Amud Bet. What if, now remember, the traditional way is you give the husband, I guess we'll call him, gives soon-to-be husband, gives money or something of value to the soon-to-be wife. But what if you switch it up? What if you say, I'm a Rava, and just to remind you, we said 2 days ago that the woman cannot initiate the Kiddushin. She can't go over to him and say, I'll give you money and marry me or something like that, right? So I'm a Rava. What if the woman says to the man, Tain manale ploni, I know you want to give me $100 to marry you. I don't really want that money, but I have a friend who's in deep need because he needs $100. Give $100 to somebody else, to Ploni, v'akadesh lecha, and I will be married to you. Meaning, I don't need you to give me the money. I'm happy for you to give someone else the money, right? Give it to charity, and through that act, I will be married to you. Says Rava mikudeshet, she's married because she doesn't have to receive the money; she just has to direct it. It seems. And how do we know that? Midin arev. We learn that from the question of a guarantor, right? If I go over to someone and say, I want to borrow $10,000 from you, and the person's like, sure, but how do I know I'm going to get it paid back, right? So we write in the shtar that somebody else, Charlie's going to co-sign. Sorry, Charlie, you agreed to this. Is going to co-sign that if I don't pay it back, he'll pay back that $10,000. And then once that shtar is written, that's a legal requirement, even though you didn't get anything out of it. The RAF got no benefit. The RAF doesn't get the loan. The RAF doesn't get any monetary value. But you see that by directing money, by helping something else happen, you get some ownership in it. So this woman is doing the same thing. She's directing money from her husband to some other guy or woman. It has nothing to do with gender, obviously. So therefore, midin arev, and arev, says the Gemara on the top line, lav afal gav delomati hanali yadeh. The arev gets nothing of tangible benefit, right? The arev is just a cosigner, and they don't get the property. They don't have any rights to the property, but hamisha ben nafshe. They how do you translate that? They accept responsibility, right? They indebt themselves. It's probably the best translation. So, hi ititanami, this woman also, even though she got none of the money because her husband gave it to someone else, since she directed it, Kamshabda, she accepts responsibility, like she makes herself subject to it, and she gives over herself to that person. So that is a valid form of Kiddushin. That's case number one. Says Rava, I have another case. What if a woman says, now this is an even more fascinating case. A woman says, Heilich mana hitkadshi leploni. Look, I would like you to give me $100, right? But not to marry you. I'm not agreeing to marry you. I'll be married to someone else, right? This guy's got a good friend, and his friend wants to marry this woman. The friend has no money. So she says to the friends, right, Ruvain and Shimon, let's say, right? So Shimon wants to marry Leah, that's his mother, but Shimon wants to marry Leah, and he has no money or whatever. He doesn't have the means. So she says to Ruvain, look, Ruvain, you give me $100, and for that kinyan, I'll marry Shimon, right? I'm not marrying you. I'll marry him. Now again, Kiddushin, as you recall, unlike Gittin, has to be done with full acceptance and knowledge of the woman, right? So she can't. There's no tricks here. Right, so she has to agree to it and know exactly what's happening. So she says, I will take money from Ruvain in order to marry Shimon. So here she's getting something, but the person giving it to her is not the one marrying her. So does that work for Kiddushin? It says Rava, let's see, fourth line from the top. Helech mana, give me a mana. The hitkadshi leploni, and I will, through that, accepting that mana, marry someone else, mikudesha, that she is married. Because the person who's marrying her does not have to be the one giving the money. How do we know that? Midin Eved Kanaani. We learned that from the case of an Eved, right? We said before, and we're going to say more, that an Eved who wants to purchase his freedom or her freedom can purchase their freedom with money, right? If an Eved gives whatever agreed amount money to the owner, the Eved can be koneh themselves. Now, the question we asked before is, how can an Eved get money? Anything an Eved owns, their owner owns. So what do you mean? How does the Eved have $10,000 lying around? So the explanation we gave, there's a couple explanations. One is that he got money that's out of the purview of his owner. But the other explanation was that a third party came in and said, we will buy his freedom, right? So and this was, I think, pretty common, and even today, I think people try to do this, right? People who are enslaved and don't have the means to get out, someone else will purchase their freedom. So it's the same thing, right? Because someone else is purchasing the man's freedom or woman's freedom, giving the money to the owner. But the one who the owner, the new person here, the slave here is equivalent to the wife, right? The one who's acquiring himself or going through the kinyan is not the one who gave, I guess is not the one who gave the money, right? Slave is like the husband here, I guess. Sorry. The slave is not the one who gave the money, right? Because someone else gave the money on behalf of the slave. And the same thing is true here. Someone else gave money on behalf of the husband. So says the Gemara, that's me Eved Kanani, because Eved Kanani lav afagav delu kamas chasav v'lo midi. The Eved Kanani didn't lose anything. He didn't pay his own way because he can't. But kakani nafshe, he acquires himself his freedom by someone else paying it. Hi gav v'nami, this man, this husband, who's the equivalent to the Eved here, afagav delu chasav v'lo midi, even though he didn't actually pay up for the marriage, his friend did. Kakani lahai itata, he is koneh, this woman. Which is the equivalent of the Eved being acquiring himself through someone else giving the money. So that is the two rules of Rava. So Again, usually we think the husband gives the money to the wife. Rava taught two rules. One is that the husband can give money to someone else on the direction of the wife. And the second is that it doesn't have to be the husband giving the money. It could be someone else giving the money to the wife on behalf of the husband or for that purpose. Says the Gemara now, of course, if you put those two things together, you get into a very bizarre situation where neither the husband gives money to somebody else for the wife to marry that somebody else, right? The man gives money to somebody else who becomes the husband, right? And that person who got the money now becomes the husband acquiring money, with the exact opposite of what you think of with Kiddushin. Like Kiddushin, you think husband gives money to wife. Here, someone gives money to husband and through that he acquires the wife. So let's read that inside. If you say Tain Mana Leploni, a woman says, give money. So again, her name is Sarah, we'll say. And she says to Reuven, give money to Shimon, give 100 shekel to Shimon, the Kadesh Ani Lo. And through that, I will marry Shimon, right? So then Mikudeshet, that counts, Midin Shneim, when you combine these two halachot. The first is Arev, right? The fact is that in Arev means that she doesn't have to get money in order to acquire, in order to be mishabed herself. Excuse me, Arev, even though nothing actually came to her hand, she agrees to, and Arev agrees to be responsible. This woman agrees to be married. This woman too, she gives over herself. It says, well, 1 second. That's true about an Arev, Midami. Arev, hi, the Kakanile, Kakasar Memona. In a usual case of Arev, the person who's acquiring the loan, right, or the one who's giving the loan loses money, meaning they give over a loan. But hi, Gavra, Hakakani Le, this time, the guy who's marrying her hasn't lost, he's not giving anything, right? Because Shimon is the husband, but Shimon got the money here. So it's not comparable to an Arev. It says more about Evi Kanani Yochia, right? Then if you look at the second halacha, which is the lima from Evi Kanani, which is that you can purchase yourself without your own money. Someone else can do it on your behalf, right? The Loka Chasar Mimona, the Evi Kanani didn't lose any money in the transaction. The Kakani Nafshein, he's able to acquire himself. Well, that's not the same because Midami, Hatam Hachdika Mekani, Kakani. Right there, at least the one who is giving over, the previous owner of the slave, got some money. Here, the woman got nothing, right? Because she didn't get paid at all. But here, the woman, she gave over herself in marriage, and she didn't get anything out of it. But Arev Yochia, right? But then you go back to Arev, because in Arev, you give over, you accept responsibility, you get nothing in exchange. And so this beautiful logical conclusion, which the Gemara does not have a problem with now, is that you can basically combine both innovations. Again, just to be clear, the husband, Shimon, whoever it is, has to go to her and say, Ariat Mekudeshetli, right? There's no, because remember, we said 2 days ago, she cannot be the one who says, I'm marrying you by giving you money, right? But the point is that she gets benefit by directing the money to where she wants it to go. Now, Rav asked, okay, let's set some further questions about marriage. Heilich mana, makadesh ani lecha, right? The woman says to a man, this gets very specifically, I will give you a mana, and I want you to marry me through it. So not I'm marrying you, but I will give you the money. And now we're not sure exactly how this works yet. Okay, we'll see in a second. So Amar Marzutra Mishmeder of Papa Mikudeshet, right? Rav Papa said, Marzutra said in the name of Rav Papa, that's Kiddushin. So if a woman walks over to a man and says, look, I'll give you $100. Through that, you accepting it, I want our marriage to be chal. And he says, okay, Hareyat Mekudeshet li, through the $100 that you give me, right? Or let me rephrase it, the $100 that I accept from you, that would count as Kiddushin. So asked Rav Ashi, the Marzutra, I don't understand. Now we think, right, that what's happening here is that there's basically 2 things going on. There's mammon, there's money, and there's the woman herself, the Kiddushin, which is essentially her body, right, her guf, her physical part. So we think it's referring to a similar concept of what's called, really, essentially, it's where you add on, right, where you have one kinyan and you add something to that kinyan. That's what we think it is right now. Okay, we're going to clarify that. Excuse me, right? So we think it's a case where basically I go to someone, I say, I'll sell you my field, and I'll also throw in, I don't know, 10 bushels of wheat. right? And then your kona, it's called kinyan agav, that through acquiring the field, you also can add in other things. So said Rav Ashi up to Marzutra in Cain, havle nechasim sheyesh lam achrayut. But what's happening is you have nechasim that are permanent, which is like a person or a field, right? That are niknim, in this case a woman, im nechasim she'ein lam achrayut, that are being koneh agav at the same time that you're being koneh something that doesn't have achrayut, which means ready cash, right? Money or metaltalin. We learned, and we're going to have this Mishnah later, that the opposite can work. So what does the Mishnah say later? If you're talking about objects that have no responsibility, things that are essentially temporary, meaning I sell you something that no longer can be traced back to me. So anything metaltalin, anything that's money, niknim, those things can be koneh, can be acquired with the same time as nechasim sheyesh lam achrayut. Right? It's the same time as nechasim that do have achrayut, like a field. Right? If I sell you my field, but then it turns out that I owed someone else money, they can always come back and collect the field, right? So the field basically carries along the responsibilities that I have, even though I give it over to you, right? So the same thing is true about an Evid, let's say. So those things, you can be koneh, says the Mishnah later, b'kesef, b'shtar, b'chazakah. The ways you can be koneh a field, by money, by shtar, and by chazakah, right? Here, you're basically saying that you're giving money to the husband, and agav the money, you're being makneh yourself, which is essentially equivalent, Rashi says, equivalent to a person is equivalent to karka, right? Tosfos has a different pshat, but that's how Rashi's simple pshat is that, we view an eved like karka, we view any human like karka. It's something that's not combustible, I guess I would say, or usable, right? So you seems like you're doing it backwards. You're giving the money and you're acquiring the person agav the money. And the Mishnah says the opposite has to happen. You have to give the object, the field, the karka, and agav, you can be koneh money, right? Says the Gemara, this is not what we're referring to. Amrle, mi savrit, the Amrle agav. You think that the way this works is through agav? This works through what we call influencers. Hacha, the adam chashuv askina. We're talking about you're giving the money. The husband here is a very famous Instagram star. I don't know if this has relevance to the people on this call, but Rosa understands what I'm talking about. In the Gemara's time, it was called an Adam Chashuv, right? A person who is very respected. And why? So you want that person, when you give something to that person and they wear your thing or they accept your thing, you get capital, you get value through that happening, right? Which is why people will pay someone else a lot of money to show up at their event or wear their clothing or something like that, right? So it wasn't so different back then. It's just that they had fewer means of dissemination, I guess, right? So basically, behahi hana'ah, the kamikabo matana mina, through the benefit to the woman that this guy of such influence, he's an Adam Chashuv, would accept the gift from me. That's a big thing. He doesn't accept gifts from anybody, right? So because he accepts a gift from me, it goes up my social capital, my self-worth goes up. So Gamra umakni le nafsha, she is makne herself to him as marriage, and that's the value. So basically, we're not talking about any person. She can't walk over to any person and say, here's $100. I want to be married to you through you accepting this $100. But if it's a person who is an Adam Chashuv, and when word gets around that he accepted a gift or a coat or whatever, he's wearing jewelry from this person, right? Then it's very beneficial to her. It doesn't have to be very, it could be a little bit beneficial to her. And she is married through that benefit that she gets, that this person is willing to wear her thing or do her thing. And Itmar Nami, Mishmei de Rava, Mimona. And in fact, Rava also said all of these rules are also true by Mammon, meaning all of these principles that I can do Kiddushin through a third party or through directing money elsewhere are the same thing true by money. Right? If a person comes to me and says, I want to buy your bicycle, which is money, right? It's in Taltalin. And I say, okay, I'll sell you my bicycle if you give $100 to someone else. That counts. The same way a woman says, I'll be married to you if you give $100 to somebody else. It says, but tzricha. Rava needs to tell you that it's true about marrying a woman and it's true about monetary things, even though they're very similar. Why do you have to say about both? Excuse me. Diash min kiddushin. Because if you only said the halacha by marriage, you might say, well, mishum daha, and this is very important halacha, which we're going to quote many times, which is that the barrier to marriage in some ways is lower than the barrier to other kinyanim, because we assume that a woman wants to get married. Okay, Why? The woman might be interested in even a small amount of benefit in order to get married. As Reish Lakish said, there's benefit for a woman to be with do means dual, right, with someone else, than to be alone. So there is inherent benefit, again, according to Reish Lakish, who may or may not have known, that to a woman wants to be married, not so much for she gets something out of it, but it's just the fact of being with someone else. And so therefore, because unlike buying a bike, where you want to buy the bike because you want to use the bike, right? There's no value in sort of just having a bike, but in marriage it might be different. And therefore a woman might accept a lower amount of value in order to get married. Aval mimona emalo, but maybe by monetary things it wouldn't be true. The Ashmina mimona, right? If it's by money, you might say, well, money, remember, by monetary things, you can actually just forgive it. I can go to someone who wants to buy something from me and say, I forgive you from having to pay me. By Kiddushin, you can't do that. You can't forgive the person for having to pay you. You can't get married and say, let's imagine as if you gave me a ring, right? So therefore, and therefore we need both cases. Okay, continues Rava, excuse me, on the first of the wide lines. Amar Rava, if a man says to a woman, I want you to marry half of me. Okay, here's a ring, I'm marrying half of you. Says the Mishnah, says Rava Mikudesha. Okay, Chatzai means half of me, not half of you, sorry. Marry half of me, you're married. Okay, what's it like to marry half a person? I don't know. We'll find out, right? But if you say Chatziyech Mikudesha, if a man says to a woman, I want to marry half of you, or again, we're not using the word marriage. I don't know how you use the word marriage in Hebrew, but use the word mikudeshet, right? Half of you is mikudash to me, eno mikudeshet. Then she's not married. Okay. Now what's the difference? So Amalei Abaya, the Rava, Abaya said to Rava, I don't get it. I assume the reason that you have a problem with marrying half a woman is that the pasuk says ki yikach ish isha. A man marries a woman, meaning a man and a woman, not half a man and not half a woman. So then you should have problems both directions, right? So why is it that you say I'll marry half the woman? It doesn't work because isha marachmana. Because the Torah says a woman, not chatzi isha. But then the same thing is true about a man. Hachanami ish amarachmana v'lo chatzi ish. So why is there a difference if a man says half of me is mikudash to you, or which works according to Rava, and not half of you is mikudash to me, which doesn't work? Amalei. So Rava said, you don't know, that's nothing to do with the pasuk. Hatam, it has to do with the fact that, as unfair as it may be, a man can marry more than one woman, but a woman cannot marry more than one man, right? So you can't. So maybe when a man says, "I'm marrying half of me is marrying you," he's saying, I'm also going to watch football on Sunday, or I'm also going to marry another person, right? So meaning, I'm not, all of me is not committed to you, right? That's the reality. Sorry, Effie, I know it's upsetting, but the reality is that a man in those days, we don't do it anymore, can marry more than one woman if he had the finances to support it. But a woman can never marry more than one man, and so therefore you can't say I'm marrying half you. You can't go marry somebody else. So that's what Rava says. A woman can't marry two people. So therefore, half of a woman, there's no, how could the rest of her be married? Can't a man marry two people? And therefore, that's what he's saying to her. That half of me is married. I'm only committing some of myself to you. Don't get upset. If I want to marry somebody else, don't claim I never told you. I'm warning you right now. I'm only committed to this partially. I'm leaving room for someone else. Sounds like a great marriage. Okay, Amrle Marzutra Braid the Rav Mari the Ravina. Says Rav Marzutra Braid the Rav Mari to Ravina the Nifshala Kiddusha Bekula. I don't get it. Now, this is a fascinatingly bizarre statement, I'll say. But to go to another kind of, remember, we've all so far we've been comparing marriage to kinyanim, right? Because it is. But of course, the word we use for marriage is Kiddushin, which automatically makes you think of something else, which is hektish, right? When you give something to hektish, right, says Marzutra, we have a halacha that if you go to the Beit HaMikdash and say, I want to dedicate half of this animal to the Beit HaMikdash, what happens? The whole animal goes to the Beit HaMikdash because you can't give half a thing. So why don't you say, now again, we're going to obviously clarify this because there are a lot of differences between Kiddushin and hektish, But we're going to clarify, but maybe once you say a woman basically becomes hektish to a man, she becomes dedicated to that person, why doesn't it nitpashet in the whole thing, the whole object, right? So ask the meaning, and so even if you say, I'll marry half of you, which Rava said does not work because you can't marry half of a woman, why don't you say it's like he married the whole woman and his statement of half goes to the whole thing, right? So ask Mar Zutra, Mari the Ravina, Bekula. Why can't the hektish, meaning the status, I'd say here, spread to the whole woman, and therefore she should be married, even though he only said, I want to marry half of you? Nilo Tanya, didn't we learn in a Braita? Homer Raglas Shalzu Ola, Tekula Ola. If you go up to an animal and you say, the animal of this, the leg of this animal should be a carbon Ola, right? Which we're equating to saying, I want to marry half a woman, then the whole animal becomes an Ola, right? Hey, Kula Ola. And even according to this machloket, actually, even according to the Tana, says it doesn't spread. That's only because you're talking about a leg, and a leg is a non-essential part. You're talking about something which is not essential for life. If you're makdish half the animal, right, which is clearly something in the neshama tluyaba, you can't live without half, like either a person or an animal, or if you're makdish the heart or the lungs, right, or something like that. So havikula ola, that everyone agrees the whole thing would be an ola. So why don't you say the same thing about a wife, where you are marry half of a woman? It should be a marriage and spread throughout the whole woman, so to speak. That's ridiculous. Midami hatam dehema. You're talking about an animal, right? And an animal doesn't have any say. There's no knowledge. There's no other sentient consciousness deciding, oh, you want half of me for a carbon? I'll give you the whole thing, kind of thing. You know what I mean? Like, obviously, it's not inanimate, of course, but it's not a dot, right? Hachab dat acheret, right? Here, there's another. The woman has to decide what she wants to accept. If she agreed to marry you for half of her, you can't just say automatically it spreads the whole thing. She didn't agree to that. She agreed to half, right? So now, and she did agree to half, but a half doesn't work. So even though she agreed to half, it doesn't matter. And what is this similar to? This is in fact similar to people. What if you have an animal? You have an animal that's owned by two partners, right? So two partners own an animal together. And one of them decides, I want to be makdish half of the animal that I own, and the other one doesn't. So that's similar to this woman, because the woman owns herself. She's a partner in both parts of herself. And she's agreeing to marry one part, but not the other part. So that's similar to this case. We have a behema shel shnei shutzvim. Two partners own an animal. Hikdish chetzia, right? One of them says, okay, I want to make my part kodesh. You go to the Beit HaMikdash and they say, this is very problematic because it's very hard to kill half an animal, right? So the guy says, oh, good point. He goes back to his partner. He says, can I buy you out for $100? And the partner says, okay. So he gives the partner $100. He says, okay, now I want to make the other half of the animal kodesh. So does that work or not? No. Says the Braita, the chazar v'lakcha v'hiktisha. Sorry, it does work. Take it back. You go back and you buy it from your partner and you're makdish the second half of the animal. Kiddusha, sure, it belongs to the Beit HaMikdash. Ve'eno kreva, but you can't bring it on the Mizbeach because it didn't get kodesh at one spot, right? It was half kodesh, and at that point you couldn't bring it on the Mizbeach. And then you added the other half, but it was something called dichui. Dichui means it was pushed off from being a hektish. But says the Braita oset tumura, you can, if you say to another animal, I want this other animal to be like this, it will work. The other animal will also become kodesh, but it also can't be brought in the mizbeach. The tumurato kiyotzeba, that it's half and half, right? It's a kodesh, but not suitable for the mizbeach. And shmami natzlat. In fact, you learn three things from this funny case of partners. What do you learn? Shmami na balei chayim nidachim. One thing you learn is that you can a living thing can be pushed off from being usable on the Mizbeach. There's a machloket about this, whether it's only something that's dead, an animal after it's killed, or after it's slaughtered, right? Can be nidcha, or even balei chayim. You see here that even a live animal, where basically I was makdish half an animal, at that point you could not bring it on the Mizbeach. Why? Because the other half was not kodesh. Just like a woman who accepts Kiddushin doesn't spread to the other half, right? And since at that moment it was possible for the Mizbeach, even if later I went and bought the other half and was makdish it never can become suitable again for the Mizbeach. Once off the table, you're completely off the table. That's the word dichui. Dichui means pushed away, right? So you see that balei chayim or nidachim. That's one rule. Shma mina, you have to also see that dichui me'ikara havi dichui. You see that, excuse me, when we talk about pushing things off, again, there's a machloket elsewhere about whether that can only happen after something was ra'oi lemizbeach, then it became pasul, then it became ra'oi again, right? Excuse me. Let's say, for example, it became tamei, and then everybody in the tzibur became tamei. So once it became, then you can bring it again. So, but here you see, it was never kosher and then pasul. At the moment you were makdish it, was already pasul, because that moment only half of it. You see that counts as dichoy. And shma mina yesh dichoy b'damim, and you also see that there's dichoy based on the fact that somebody else owned the other part, even though at that point it was only kodesh for its damim, not kodesh for kedushat hamizbeach. So you see all these rules from this bright. Okay, next case, says Rava. You see Rava is very intrigued by these cases of Kiddushin. Second line from the top. By Rava, what if a man says to a woman, I want to marry you, but I want to do it in stages, like an installment plan. I want to marry chatziech b'chatzi pruta, v'chatziech b'chatzi pruta. I don't know why he would do this, but that's not the point. The point is we can illustrate really great cases. So the man has a pruta, and he says to his beloved, right? I'll marry half of you with half the pruta and the other half pruta. Why didn't you say the whole with one pruta? We don't know. Would that work? So remember, you can't marry half of a woman, but here you're clearly marrying both halves of the half of a woman, right? So can you do that? So Mao, kivan d'amar lachatzi pruta paska. Is it not going to work because he said half a pruta? Odilma monev holechu. Right? He's counting. He's going, here's one, here's two. I'm doing it in steps, basically. So does that work or not? Says the Gemara in Tim Salomer Moneva Holecho that it does work, right? He said it together. So since he basically the upshot of what he said was, I'm giving you a pruta and I'm marrying the whole you, that counts. What if he said chetziech bepruta, the chetziech bepruta? What if he said, I want to marry half of you with one pruta, with this ring, and half of you with the other ring? So then that's more problematic because each ring is valuable as a pruta, but he's trying to marry half of her and he's not allowed to. So do you say, Kivan Amrla bepruta, pruta, paska lemilte? He split it up. He said, I'm marrying half of you, which doesn't work. I'm marrying the other half of you, which also doesn't work, and therefore I didn't marry anything. Oh, Dilma, it's the same time. Kol biyume monevolecho. It's the same day, which doesn't necessarily mean the same day. It means together. So maybe that should count. And in Tim Salomer, kol biyume monevolecho, that in fact it does count. What if he said a different day? Look, I don't have enough money. I want to give you two rings, but one of them hasn't arrived yet. It's late in shipment. So here, I want to do half the marriage today with this ring, and I'll come back tomorrow and do the other half of the marriage with the other ring. Okay, maybe whatever the case is. So do you say, Kivan Amala the Machar Paska? He said, okay, I'm marrying half today, half tomorrow. And so he split it up, and you cannot marry half a woman. So therefore, he lost his shot, basically. Oh, Dilma, Hachikamerla. He's saying, look, Kiddushin matchalu meha'idna. Look, we're starting the marriage right now with the first ring, right? Umigmar lo nigmar ad machar. But it won't be finished. We won't cut the cake until tomorrow when you get the second ring. So maybe he's actually doing the Kiddushin, but he's speaking out that he's going to give her a second one. So what's the case there? We don't resolve this case. So I'd advise people not to do it. Or if you say shnei katzich bepruta, Mao, right? What if you say to a woman, look, I want to marry both halves of you with this ring? Why he would say that again, I have no idea. But do you say, Vaday b'chad zimna kamerla, obviously saying it with one pruta, right? It's one ring. O dilma ein isha mitkadesh b'chatzain klal, right? The point is you cannot marry part of a woman. And so even if you marry all parts of a woman, none of the parts count. So what do you say? And Teku, we do not resolve these questions. So again, be very careful that when you get married, a man who says to a woman, I want to marry you, you marry the entire woman.
So you can't do anything.
The first thing you could do, presumably. Because at the same time.
It isn't at the same time.
Right. We're not sure. Take it. Next case that Rava said, halfway down the daf of Daf Zayin Amud Bet, further interesting and somewhat far-fetched cases. Ba'i Rava, Shnei. It's actually a very interesting thing I'll just point out because the general rule of the Rambam, which we follow, is that when the Gemara says im tim salomar, right, it usually means that we paskin that way, right? So that the Gemara says, is it A or B? And if you say it's A, what about A1 and A2, right? So that's the way it seems. And here, of course, we sort of went the opposite way because here you started off by saying, I want to marry you, half of you with this half a pruta and half of you with that half a pruta. right? And we said, well, it seems like it's being done together, so it would work, right? And then the final case is where, so it seems like you could marry her with half a pruta and half a person, right? And then the question is, what if it's the same day? What if it's a different day? But then the last case actually walks back, right? Because the last case is one pruta for each half of you, and we end up with teku that we don't know the answer there, which if you possibly like the first one, seemingly should be okay. So this is an interesting discussion, whether or not it's goes against the Rambam in this case, or whether you actually ruined it by putting together the one pruta for two people, making it sound like you thought you can marry half and half, right? Not that you're just combining, but you actually thought that's what happened, and therefore it's worse, is the question. Anyways, that is that case of marrying half a woman. What about, this is also a very interesting case, what if it turns out that a man has two daughters, something that's been known to happen, and someone approaches him and says, I have two sons, and they don't really have to be sons, I know two people, and I'll give you a pruta to accept Kiddushin for your two daughters, right? So the person giving the money is giving a pruta, right? The person accepting the money is accepting a pruta. But each of the people being married there's not pruta for each person, right? There's only one ring for the two married. That's not going to go over very well, right? So what is the case? Remember, the father is makabel kiddushin for his children, as long as they're minors, right? So boy Rava, if someone says, this has to be a man, right? So I'm sorry, here in this case, we're talking about another father, but shtei binotayach, your two minor daughters should be married to shnei banai, to my two sons, bipruta. We got one ring. So here's the ring, right? It's worth a pruta. Let's do it to not consummate the marriage, consummate the kinyan, right, of kiddushin. So ma, is that good enough? So what do you think, Rosa? Not good enough, right? It's half a pruta. But maybe vatar notein umikabel aslina. And this is fascinating, right? Because maybe the whole reason you need a pruta is because you need a pruta, not because you need to give something of value to her, but because you need something for the kinyan, right? You can't have the legal exchange basically unless you have something notable. And here you have something notable. So it's one kinyan of two people, and it's not the woman's not getting a pruta, or each getting half a pruta. But maybe it's not about the person; it's about the actual ma'aseh of the kinyan.
The documents are separate.
And the husbands have to say to each woman, "Hurry up, Kiddushin." There's no question. But the kinyan itself maybe is enough, and here it's one kinyan. So do you say batar notenu mikabel azlina? And you go after the giver and the taker, which is fine. It's one person to one person, and you have a pruta va'ika nimona. You have enough money. Otilma batar ditu azlina. Or do you go after the woman, and it has to be a pruta for each person? So you have to give to the father. Right? The woman doesn't get either of them here. Then you have to give to the father a pruta for each daughter he's marrying off. Haleka, you don't have a taker, and we don't resolve that question. So this is one of the great open questions here, is the money the kinyan, or is the money a gift essentially, or exchanged for, not exchange, but a gift to the woman? By Rav Papa, what if a person says, okay, you ready for the next case? This gets a little more tedious here, but what if a man goes to another person and says, look, I stayed in your house over the weekend and noticed that you have a wonderful daughter. I'd love to marry her. And I see that you have a great cow. Can I get both of them? Let me buy bitcha uparatcha. I want to buy your daughter and your cow. And I only have a pruta. The pruta maho. So I want to give you a pruta. Again, now, same kind of question, which is, the person has to agree. Obviously, they're worth more than a pruta. The cow, it's not something you'd pay. The point is, doesn't it make a kinyan? If the person agrees, right? So just to be clear, if I went over to you and said, can I buy your cow? And you said, sure. You don't own the cow just because I said, sure. You have to do an action, right? To me, konet. One of the actions could be money, right? You can also do mashicha. Remember, you can pull the cow, but you have to give money. So what if you did both with one pruta? So I'm reading it inside. By Rav Papa, bitcha uparatcha bepruta mahu. Is that a kinyan? Me, I'm reading on, well, you probably mean half and half. Bitcha bechatzi pruta, which wouldn't be enough. You can't marry someone with half a pruta. And paratcha bechatzi pruta, which also isn't enough. Odilma bitcha bepruta, or you're saying, no. I want both. I'm only going to marry your daughter if I get the package deal. But I'm acquiring the daughter with the pruta, and the paratcha is b'mashicha, right? I'm going to pull the kapara, and I'm going to acquire it that way. I don't need money to acquire a para. I just only want to go into the deal if I get a package. So take it. We don't know the answer. And what if you say the next case, bitcha v'karka'a, right? By Rav Ashi, bitcha v'karka'acha b'pruta mahu. I will be happy to marry your daughter. I want to marry your daughter, and I want a house out of it. So if you give me the daughter in the house, here's a pruta. Mahu, pitcha b'chatzi pruta v'karkacha b'chatzi pruta, the same question. He's trying to buy two things with one unit, which can't buy two things. Odilma, he's saying, no, I'll marry your daughter bitcha b'pruta and karkacha b'chazaka. I'll acquire your karka the way you can acquire karka by living there without anyone objecting. You own it after a period of time. So take it. We don't know the answer. It's a similar question. One final case, which is very, very relevant, by the way. This finally much more relevant than people buying houses and cows, right? Wives and cows. Who gavra da'akdish b'shiroi, right? A man goes over to a woman and she says, I want to marry you. I'm going to give you this beautiful silk. So usually say shirai is silk, but I think it just means very fine clothing. I've got this gorgeous coat to give you, this gorgeous silk shawl. I want to marry you with this thing. So what's the halacha? No, it's worth much more than a pruta, right? So Rabbah says, lo tzrichi shuma. You don't need to evaluate how much this silk thing is worth. As long as we all know it's worth more than a pruta. She may think it's worth $10,000 because it's an original Chanel. It may be a knockoff and worth only $50, but either way, it's worth more than a pruta. Okay, this is why it's very relevant. And Rav Yosef says, tricha shuma. No. You have to evaluate and say how much it's worth before you get married, Rashi says. And then when you give it to her, she has to know exactly what she's getting. And the reason being, according to Rav Yosef, is that we worry that if she thinks this is an original Chanel scarf and it's worth thousands of dollars, and it turns out it's a knockoff and worth $50, $50 is enough to marry a person, but not if the person thinks that they're getting $10,000. And it has huge implications if, for example, if someone gives someone a ring, right, and they think it's real diamond, then it's not real diamond, right? So it's always worth more than a pruta. But it turns out, according to Rav Yosef, that if you marry someone, don't tell them what the ring is really worth, that they're not married, right? Which is crazy, right? Because it probably happens a lot. Of course, it happens sometimes on purpose and probably often happens by mistake where you are swindled into buying a non-real diamond. But anyways, so this is a question. You probably notice, I've heard of this. I don't think I've ever seen it because I don't go to that many weddings. And sometimes at weddings, they'll actually say to the edim, do you verify this ring is worth at least a shavar pruta? And that's part of the reason they do it, because they want to acknowledge it doesn't have to be worth $5,000 or whatever ring, $50,000 in order for it to be a Kiddushin. It just has to be worth more than a shavar pruta. She knows that, she hears that, she accepts it, and you get rid of this problem. But it's actually a very practical problem because we use a ring, not cash, right? So that's where Rav Yosef says, Tricha Shuma. Now says the Gemara on the last of the narrow lines. Now, if he says to her, look, I'm marrying you with anything. Look, I'm giving you the scarf. It's worth a minimal amount, or it's worth not minimal amount, but anything. And she says, I don't care what it's worth. I'll accept whatever it is. And you don't need to know how much a scarf is worth. It could be $50 or $5,000. It's enough. It's more than a pruta, right? But now, if he said to her, I'm giving you a scarf that's worth $50 and lo shavu chamishin, it's not worth that, then it doesn't matter what you do. Hello shavu. Then obviously she's not married. She didn't get what she agreed to. The question is, where you actually said, I'm giving you a scarf that's worth $50, and it is worth $50, but Rabbah said, Amar lo tzricha shuma. So Rabbah says, okay, that's fine. You don't need an official, clarity report saying how much it's worth. But Rav Yosef says, tzricha shuma. Why? Because she doesn't trust you, right? Kivan itita lo bekiya b'shuma. Since she, not specifically her, people in general don't know. You get. I don't think anyone in this room gets a diamond, can look at it and say what it's really worth, right? Same thing is true about many things, right? So you can't know what it's worth. You're not a bucky in that. So lo samcha daita. So then you don't rely. She doesn't believe it. And therefore, since she doesn't believe it, she doesn't agree to be married. She's just going through the motion. She thinks, oh, you're probably giving me something fake and I'm not really accepting it. And so therefore, you have to get that certificate of authenticity and the value before you give it to her, if you don't give money, right? So that, again, this is why it's very relevant either to get it documented or to say it doesn't really matter how much it's worth. Some just said, I'm going to read the final lines. That's the opposite. Hunami pligi Rav Yosef. That even if you say, I'll marry you with any value, and he says, okay, she says, I'll accept any value, right? And he says, okay, here's a beautiful Chanel scarf. Then even there, Rav Yosef would say she's not married. Why? Because pligi Rav Yosef. Because Amar Shava Kesef or Yoke Kesef. That when you give something value of Kesef, it has to be similar to Kesef. Ma Kesef dekayetz, af Shava Kesef nami dekayetz. Just like money is defined, when you give an object, you have to be very clear. how much it's worth. And so according to Rav Yosef, if you marry a woman with a ring, you have to which is a little bit challenging, right? You have to say, this is what it's worth, this is the value, and she knows what she's getting. Again, even if she doesn't care what she's getting, she'll marry you whether it's a $1,000 ring or $10,000 ring or whatever rings nowadays cost, right? She has to know, or I guess you could do or rely on Rava, but that's what Rav Yosef says. So we'll stop there. I think Miriam is picking it up tomorrow, correct?
I am. I'm doing it at 7 a.m. tomorrow, though.
Okay, please put that in the
Yeah,
chat.
I am.
Okay, everyone.
it-
Shavua Tov.
Shavua tov. So I just have a question about the last thing. What happens if there is no evaluation of whatever it is that he's giving her, right? And she still goes through the motions and the whole marriage takes place with Bia and everything. And then later on, she's actually somebody comes and said, oh, this is really not worth much of anything.
So, presumably then I don't, paskin off of Daf Yomi, I would say, just to be very clear. But it does seem like we paskin like Rabbo, who says you don't really need to. But so unlike Rav Yosef, you don't need to do a shuma. You don't need to, right? Rav Yosef says you never trust it unless you know what it's worth. But your case is a little bit different because your case, she had false understanding, right? She
Right.
thought she was getting something. That's a
I was
mekach
thinking
ta'od.
the same question, Miriam.
So
Okay.
in your case, I think it would be a problem. I think there would be a real doubt about that marriage. She
It
was-
would be useful to puzzle a Kiddushin in an Aguna situation.
But you have to really.
He brings the ring to the Beit Din. They realize that it's not really gold; it's
Right.
steel. They figure that out by putting a magnet to it, which is pretty trivial. And they say this ring is not worth a pruta. You never were married.
Right, but Miriam's case is beyond that, not worth a pruta. It's even if it is worth a pruta, it's worth many prutot, but it's not worth what you thought. You were told this is, whatever, this is platinum, and it's worth $500, and turns out it's silver and it's worth $50, right? So that's a mekach ta'od. You were mistaken, right? So, but anyways, I wouldn't start, you need greater minds than me to discuss that.
Yeah.
I think it would be a big problem. Okay,
Okay.
Shavua Tov, everyone.
Thank you. Shavua tov.
Thank you all. Good day.